In 1781, Weimar in Thüringen was a small country town. Its 6,300 residents were for the most part farmers, artisans and shopkeepers. It was also the capital of the sovereign state of Saxe-Weimar and seat of the young Duke, Karl August. Life at court was more frugal than extravagant. The Duke had to save money to rebuild his palace, the Wilhelmsburg, which had burnt down 7 years earlier. So Weimar wasn't exactly an exciting place for a young promising writer like Johann Wolfgang Goethe, who had already made a name for himself with The Sorrows of Young Werther and Götz von Berlichingen. Goethe had come for a visit in 1775 at the invitation of the Duke, who then persuaded him not to go home to Frankfurt, but to stay in Weimar as his advisor in matters of state. Goethe, now a privy councillor, took up residence in a simple cottage on the far side of the river Ilm. Here, at some slight distance from the town and the court, he sought to retain a degree of independence. The Duke had also appointed him Minister of Finance and the Army. Goethe, of all people, who much preferred to spend his time in the solitude of his garden writing poetry, love poetry of course, dedicated to his cold marble goddess, Charlotte von Stein. In real life, Frau von Stein was the unhappily married lady-in-waiting to the Dowager Duchess Anna Amalia, and mother of several children. Her influence on Goethe was considerable, at least with regard to comportment. She taught the tempestuous young genius, who was still a champion of the Sturm und Drang literary movement, sophisticated, courtly manners. Charlotte also thought it was high time for him to find a more suitable residence. Goethe was evidently not too thrilled by the idea. In October 1781, he wrote to her, "I love my house. If I also had a house in town, I would not move in." But his mother and the Dowager Duchess both urged him to find a home that more befits a man of his standing. He eventually decided to rent the house of the garrison doctor, Johann Friedrich Helmershausen, whose grandfather had built the large Baroque house on Frauenplan Square in 1709. Goethe agreed to pay a rent of 36 thalers a quarter and moved in on June 3rd, 1782. He wrote to Charlotte the same day.
Good morning, dearest neighbour. A coach that brought Wieland home and the cries of the centuries have already made me feel I've been deprived of my lovely solitude, but not of you. On the contrary, I am ever closer to you.
It was probably no coincidence that he chose to rent this house on the Frauenplan. Charlotte lived at the end of the little road that ran past his garden wall. Their relationship was to last just 4 more years. In 1786, Goethe ran off to Italy without leaving word as to his whereabouts, how long he planned to be gone, or whether he intended to return to Weimar at all. As Goethe would later write, his experiences in Italy made of him a new man. He was born again. He was fascinated by the new landscapes and forms, the light and the colours. Goethe found inspiration in the simple forms of the villas and palazzi of Rome. He discovered the genius of the architect Palladio, and his own ideas about architecture changed. Goethe's new ideal was classicism, with its clear, pure and unadorned forms derived from the temples of ancient Greece and Rome. While in Rome, he wrote to Charlotte,
I have since yesterday a colossal head of Juno. It was my first love affair here.
In June 1788, Goethe returned to Weimar. He had been away for almost 2 years, and in that time he had explored new realms and become a changed man. While Charlotte had remained in the narrow confines of provincial Weimar society. The two had grown apart, and their relationship appeared to be doomed. In the weeks after his return, he often sought the solitude of his cottage. He regretted having left Italy. He'd been happy there and should have stayed. He wondered why he had come back. He didn't feel that any of his friends in Weimar understood him. But favoured by the gods as he felt himself to be, the nymphs of Weimar's river and groves were kindly disposed towards Goethe. 6 years earlier, he had this appeal to the divinities carved in stone.
You who live in rocks and trees, kind nymphs, give gladly unto each what he silently desires. Give comfort to the sad, instruction to the doubter, and let the lover find his joy.
In the summer of 1788, he met a young woman named Christiane Vulpius. She had come to see him with a petition for assistance from her brother. Christiane's spontaneity, her dark complexion and her eyes reminded him of Italy. The very day they met, Goethe gave her the keys to his cottage. She became his housekeeper and his lover. Goethe at first tried to keep the relationship secret and spent more time in his cottage in the park away from the gaze of Weimar society. Nonetheless, it soon became public knowledge that the friend of the Duke was having an affair with a simple girl of the middle class. What people did not know was that he was also writing his Roman elegies, which celebrate the joys of physical love. Christiane became pregnant the following year. Goethe remained true to her, although the court did indicate that he should give up his townhouse on the Frauenplan as long as he remained attached to that person. But it all turned out quite differently.
The inscription above the front door reads, "In honor of God and to grace the town."
Why are you standing there outside? Is this not entryway and door? If you would simply come inside, you would be well received for sure.
Whoever does venture inside is greeted by 3 statues in the spacious stairwell, plaster casts coated in graphite from the workshop of the Weimar court sculptor Martin Gottlieb Klauer. On the right, a praying boy, a copy of an early Hellenistic bronze. In the center, the greyhound of the goddess Diana. It's rather surprising to find it in such a prominent position, since Goethe didn't like dogs at all. And on the left, a fawn holding a goat. When in 1792 Karl August bought the house for him, Goethe at once set about designing this spacious new staircase in a neoclassical style that was quite new to Germany. Copies of ancient sculptures adorn the alcoves on the landing. Apollo, the Greek god of the arts and sciences, and Ares, the Greek god of war. Goethe's design for the stairwell was modeled on the spacious vestibules of Rome's Renaissance palazzi. The ceiling was decorated by the Swiss painter Johann Heinrich Meyer, who for many years was a close friend of Goethe's and advised him on matters of art. The painting shows Iris, the winged messenger of the gods, descending to earth upon a rainbow. As one continues up the deep, shallow stairs, one comes face to face with a copy of the San Ildefonso Group, a marble sculpture that dates from the 1st century BC. The identity of the youths has never been established. Some say they are Orestes and his friend Pylades. Goethe thought they were Hypnos, sleep, and his companion Thanatos, death. The figure in the drawing on the left has been identified as Dionysus, the god of wine, though Goethe thought it was Hercules. Above the doorway is a plaster relief of an eagle and Zeus's lightning bolts. It may have been seen as a stern warning to unwelcome guests not to go any further. Anyone who does proceed is greeted by the Latin inscription on the floor, Salve, welcome. Entering the yellow salon, we are confronted by an imposing bust of Zeus, a copy of the Zeus of Otricoli, larger than life and with a mass of curly locks, like the head of Antinous in the opposite corner of the room. Antinous was the young lover of the Roman Emperor Hadrian. When Antinous drowned in the Nile, Hadrian, stricken with grief, declared him a god, built shrines, and erected statues of him across the empire. Goethe painted the salon yellow because he considered it the color closest to light. This was the central room of the house and the dining room where he would entertain his guests, in an atmosphere that was warm, contented, high-spirited, gentle, and pleasing to the heart. To the right of the window stands Phocion, an Athenian general who was wrongly found guilty of treason and condemned to death. Between the windows, Medusa Rondanini, a cruel monster of so frightening an aspect that no living thing could behold her without being turned into stone. To the left, a sweet, beautiful girl with garlands around her shoulders and bosom, Clytia, who was forsaken by her lover, the sun god Helios. When she died of grief, she was transformed into a flower. The large painting to the right of the table is a copy by Friedrich Bury, with whom Goethe was friends in Rome, of part of Titian's Sacred and Profane Love. Goethe saw the original in Rome in 1787, and of the two female figures, he evidently preferred the one who represents profane love. Around the room are several colored engravings by Nicolas d'Origny of Raphael's frescoes Amor and Psyche in the Villa Farnesina in Rome. Goethe already owned these prints before he went to Italy and saw the originals. The subject matter derives from the Roman author Apuleius' story of Amor, the god of love, who falls in love with the beautiful Psyche. But because of her excessive curiosity, he leaves her. She looks for him everywhere, but can't find him. In the end, however, Zeus reunites them. Goethe assembled the sculptures and reliefs in the Yellow Salon over several decades. Only Clytia was there from the start. Although Goethe drew up plans for alterations to his house as soon as Karl August had bought it for him in 1792, he couldn't immediately oversee the building work himself.
The Duke had asked Goethe to accompany him to war. Karl August was serving as a general for Prussia, fighting the Revolutionary Army of France. 3 years earlier, in the summer of 1789, while Goethe was writing the Roman elegies in the arms of Christiane in their secluded cottage, the French Revolution had begun. Goethe, who'd been elevated to the nobility, didn't approve of the violent overthrow of the Ancien Régime. He warned that the mob might yet prove to be a tyrant and oppress the people. On January the 21st, 1793, Louis XVI of France was executed. Karl August wanted to have his friend Goethe with him at the front to chronicle the progress of the campaign. Goethe found the cries of battle and din of war the most disgusting thing in the world. He had to be away from Christiane, their child, and home in Weimar for months, and it was far from clear that he would return from this adventure alive.
August the 25th, 1792. My only wish is to see you and the little one again. One does not appreciate what one has as long as one is together. I miss you very much and love you with all my heart. September the 10th. If only you were with me now. There are big wide beds everywhere. You would not complain as you sometimes do at home. Ah, my love, there is nothing better than being together. We will say that over and over when we are reunited. September the 10th. Just think, we are so near to the Champagne and can't find a decent glass of wine. At the Frauenplan, things will be better when my love is in charge of the kitchen and cellar. Keep loving me. In my thoughts, I'm sometimes jealous and imagine that someone else might appeal to you more, because I find many men better looking and more pleasant than me. But you must not think that. Consider me the best, because I love you terribly much, and apart from you, nothing appeals to me. I often dream of you, all kinds of confused stuff, though always that we love each other. As long as I did not have your heart, what use all the rest? Now that I have it, I would like to keep it. That is why I am yours.
In December 1792, Goethe returned to Weimar for a few weeks. But then he had to rejoin the Duke near Mainz, to which the Prussians and Austrians were laying siege.
July the 3rd, 1793. If only we did not have to witness this sad spectacle. The city is bombarded every night and burns down little by little before our very eyes.
The first work Goethe wrote in his house on the Frauenplan was Reineke Fuchs, or Reynard the Fox, an epic in 12 cantos based on a medieval Low German fable. It's a satire on the chaos of the period, the dislocations in society, and the breakdown of law and order. For Goethe, hypocrisy characterized both the wily fox and contemporary society. On June the 28th, 1794, he wrote to Charlotte von Kalb,
Since this species is still highly regarded and indispensable in our time at courts and above all in republics, nothing could be more appropriate than to make the acquaintance of his ancestor.
Reineke Fuchs becomes here the timeless and immortal model for the petty crook and for the great fraudster who exploits loopholes in the law to his own advantage, and for the politician who disregards the law and eludes justice through the wiles of rhetoric, telling the people exactly what they want to hear.
In August 1793, Goethe at long last came home to Weimar. He devoted himself to remodeling his house. He created the Brückenzimmer, or bridge room, to connect the reception rooms at the front of the house and the private quarters at the rear, and to create a direct route to the garden. The painter Conrad Horny embellished the vaulted ceiling of the bridge room with flowers. One enters it from the yellow salon. It's also known as the Bustenzimmer, or bust room. In the center stands a torso of Ilioneus, one of the sons of Niobe, queen of Thebes, killed by Apollo to punish their mother for her pride. Behind him on the left is a plaster cast of Johann Heinrich Danneker's bust of Friedrich Schiller. And on the right is the only original marble sculpture in the room, the bust of the theologian Johann Gottfried Herder by Alexander Trippel. Goethe had many more plaster casts here than we see today, including 16 busts of friends and other contemporaries. This copy of the Venus of Aal was a gift from Crown Prince Karl Friedrich. The original of this statue of the goddess of beauty and feminine charm was found in Arles in 1651. Goethe wasn't particularly keen to own original works of art. He knew he would never be able to afford many. He was content to collect good copies.
I did not collect arbitrarily or on a whim, but methodically and purposefully, in order to further my education systematically. I have learned something from every object in my possession.
Beside the window, a youthful Dionysus, the god of wine and fruitfulness, revered by both Greeks and Romans. And next to the door is this copy of the Achilles that the sculptor Friedrich Tieck made for the royal palace in Berlin. Achilles was the bravest warrior in the army of Agamemnon in the Trojan War, and invulnerable except for part of his heel. This Cassandra is a copy of another sculpture made by Tieck for the palace in Berlin, where it was destroyed in a bombing raid during the Second World War. Apollo gave Cassandra, daughter of King Priam of Troy, the gift of prophecy when she agreed to be his. But then she spurned him, and in revenge, Apollo ordained that no one would believe her prophecies. A short flight of stairs leads down to the garden room. On the right are more sculptures of Greek gods. This Athene is a cast of the original in Weimar's royal palace by Friedrich Tieck, who gave it to Goethe. To the left, another Clytia. Unlike the one in the yellow salon, this Clytia is not adorned with garlands of flowers. And here is another cast of Apollo Belvedere, the first one we met at the foot of the stairs. Goethe liked to entertain his friends in this room with its view of the garden. A few steps led down into it from the wooden balcony. In the early years of Goethe's life with Christiane, the garden also served their material needs. In May 1798 she wrote to him,
"With your work it's fine. What you make lasts forever. But with us poor common folk it's quite different. I had carefully planted the vegetable garden, but in one single night the snails have eaten everything up. My lovely cucumbers are almost all gone."
At the end of the garden is the vine-covered pavilion in which Goethe would later install his collection of geological specimens. Nowadays, it's only open to small groups of visitors upon special request. Although there's not much room, all Goethe's mineralogical treasures can be seen here. For over half a century, Goethe collected rocks wherever he went on his travels. In 1780, he wrote to his friend Johann Friedrich Merck,
I must also tell you about my mineralogical investigations. I've devoted myself to these sciences with utter passion. I think a mineralogist must be like a deer who grazes without regard to the boundaries. So I have made excursions everywhere from the top of the Inselberg to Würzburg, Fulda and Hessen.
Goethe collected and systematically sorted 18,000 rock samples. They're still kept in the 470 drawers of the 18 cabinets he placed here. Goethe was proud of his collection and liked to show it to his friends. He was so interested in mineralogy because he believed it would illuminate the Urwelt, or primordial world. The exterior of the house has hardly changed since Goethe's time. The view from the pavilion window is as it was 2 centuries ago. It's as if Goethe might appear at any moment on the balcony. The aura of the place has survived, even though millions of people from all over the world have traipsed through the house and garden over the past century.
In the summer of 1794, Goethe wasn't writing much and had produced nothing of significance for months. Then a letter arrived from Friedrich Schiller. He was 10 years younger than Goethe and already well known as the author of Die Räuber, or The Robbers. Goethe had until then more or less ignored him. Nonetheless, Schiller took the initiative and invited Goethe to collaborate with him on the literary periodical he had just founded, Die Horen, or Horen. This proved to be the start of an intense intellectual and creative association between the two men, which lasted for 10 years. They soon made themselves very unpopular when they published their Xenien, a series of satires on the contemporary literature scene which they considered to be vacuous and superficial. Those they attacked hit back, and Goethe and Schiller became a favourite subject, or target, for hostile caricaturists. Goethe wanted the Horen to serve the scholarly world in the unfettered investigation of the truth and fruitful exchange of ideas. But the time was not right for such a venture, and the Horen didn't survive long. The reading public of the 1790s preferred lighter fare, sentimental romantic novels and thrilling tales of adventure. Schiller and Goethe came to need each other, to exchange ideas and review each other's work, though their personalities were very different. Schiller tended to think in rather abstract terms, and would carefully plan out his historical dramas. As director of the theatre in Weimar, Goethe made sure Schiller's plays were performed. While Schiller was centrally concerned with ideas, Goethe was more interested in intuition. Goethe also designed some stage sets for a production of Mozart's Magic Flute at his theatre. During this period, he also wrote Hermann and Dorothea. He wrote Faust, up to 150 hexameters a day for several weeks. The epic, about a shy youth who did not declare his love for the woman he adored, depicted a very German idyll. It was also a very bourgeois idyll, set in a small and cosy town, about a young couple's tender love. Goethe himself was enjoying a happy family life with his unofficial wife Christiane and their son August. All the while, Schiller kept urging Goethe to complete the first part of his Faust, which he had begun many years earlier, but then put aside.
Wavering forms, you came again, once long ago now passed before my clouded sight. Should I now attempt to hold you fast? Does my heart still look for phantoms? You bear the images of happy days, and friendly shadows rise to mind. With them, as in an almost muted tale, come youthful love and friendship. The pain is felt anew, and in the lament sounds life's labyrinthine wayward course, and tales of friends who went before me, and whom fate deprived of joyous hours. Now my voice sings for the unknown many, whose very praise intimidates my heart. The living whom my song once charmed are now dispersed throughout the world.
During this period, Goethe turned his attention to the study of the nature of light, shade and colour, and remained interested in the subject for the rest of his life. Enraptured by the harmonious and clear colours of the skies and landscapes of Italy, he realised with regret that he did not understand the phenomenon of colour. He believed that no one had succeeded in explaining the nature of colour, so he resolved to develop his own theory. He studied the literature and conducted experiments with prisms and a camera obscura he built himself. He also came up with a rather idiosyncratic psychology of colour, arguing there was a correlation between colour and human temperament. Goethe was convinced that colours are produced by the union of light and dark, by the effect of turbid media on pure white light, which he claimed is itself simple and indivisible. Goethe was certain that Isaac Newton had got it all wrong. Newton's theory stated that white light isn't simple, but can be broken up into a range of colours. Goethe was convinced that his theory was correct, and championed it with vigour until the end of his life. It was, though, wrong. For a quarter of a century, Christiane played an important role as mistress of the house on the Frauenplan. She managed the household and made it possible for Goethe to entertain his many guests, even though she was shunned and treated with contempt for many years by Weimar society.
Christiane's private quarters are not in their original state. After she died in 1816, Goethe turned them into a depot for his collection of prints and drawings. In 1953, the rooms were redecorated with furniture that had belonged to Christiane's family. In the display cabinet between the windows of the Große Stube, or large parlour, are drawings Goethe made of Christiane early in their relationship and poems he dedicated to her. Goethe described Christiane in the Roman elegies.
Once she appeared to me too, as an olive-complexioned girl, whose dark and plentiful hair, glistening, covered her brow. Shorter ringlets curled round a neck that was graceful and slender.
Goethe's mother called Christiane his bed treasure, but she was more than that. She was a good housewife who created and maintained a comfortable and cozy nest for her beloved Goethe. Seated here beside the window, she could look out onto the courtyard and keep an eye on the coachmen, servants and messengers. In the Psalmexenien or Tame Xenia, Goethe tells us what he wished for.
A pretty woman who isn't too particular about everything, but who knows best what makes me feel best.
And in his Venetian epigrams, he makes a request to the gods.
First, friendly lodgings, then tolerable food and good drink, the Germans familiar with nectar just as you are, then proper clothing and friends, confidential gossip.
But as if to justify himself, Goethe wrote in the Roman elegies,
"Not that it's kissing alone, there's also sensible talking. When she's fallen asleep, I will just lie and reflect. Often, too, in her arms I lay and worked out a poem, counting hexameter's length, softly my fingering hand measured it out on her back."
This cabinet contained some implements of everyday life, of their bourgeois family and social life. Of Christiane's possessions, very few remain. This fan, for example. Or this inkstand decorated with a porcelain putto. Favored pastimes included playing cards or taking tea and chatting about the latest events in town. Christiane was a lively woman who was rarely sad. She liked to drink wine, go dancing, and go to the theatre, even when Goethe was out of town. She told him all about it in her letters. This tarnished her reputation among later, prudish critics. Goethe often left her alone at home. He had to take trips in the service of the Duke, and when he needed peace and quiet to work, he would spend weeks at a time in the nearby town of Jena. And in the summer months, he often went to Karlsbad, the Bohemian spa town where Europe's political elites and high society congregated for the season. In 1797, when Goethe was going on a long trip to Switzerland, she wrote to him,
"When you're not there, everything is awful. And when you set off for Italy, or on some other long trip and don't want to take me with you, I will clamber up on the back of the coach with little August, because I would rather endure the wind and the rain and all kinds of unpleasant things on the journey than be without you for such a long time."
In later years, she would go to Bad Lauchstädt to take the waters. She would write to Goethe about all the gentlemen she danced with. Despite the pleasure she took in boisterous sociability, Christiane was also an exemplary housewife. In her housekeeping books, she recorded in one column all expenditures for me and August, and in another for hospitality and tea parties, which, by the way, she wasn't allowed to attend until they married. If any of the domestic staff failed to obey Christiane's orders, Goethe himself made his displeasure quite clear. He once wrote a damning reference for a cook who had incurred his anger.
"Charlotte Heuer served in my house for 2 years. She may be considered a cook, and is at times obedient, polite, even ingratiating. But in the end, the very inconsistency of her behavior made her unbearable. As a rule, she only cares to act and to cook as she sees fit. She is rebellious, importunate, and coarse. She seeks to exhaust by all means at her disposal those from whom she is to take her orders. Apart from other related vices, she also eavesdrops."
These years were the calm before the storm. A period of great turmoil was about to begin, which would also leave its mark on Goethe's house in Weimar.
In 1804, the first consul, Napoleon Bonaparte, declared himself Emperor of France. On October the 14th, 1806, the French routed the Prussian armies at Jena and Auerstedt, just a few miles from Weimar. Bands of marauding French soldiers were soon pillaging and looting in Weimar. Although Goethe made no secret of his admiration for Napoleon, he was worried about the chaos and lawlessness. He feared for the safety of his manuscripts and collections. Many people in Weimar were robbed of everything they owned. Some were killed. Drunken French soldiers demanded entry to Goethe's house and threatened to force their way into his study. But Christiane blocked their way. With the help of a servant and August's tutor, Friedrich Willemer, they managed to push them out and barricade the door. Thereupon, Goethe married his Christiane, and not only out of gratitude, they'd already lived together for 18 years, and now his bed treasure, the Demoiselle Vulpius, whom Weimar society had spurned for so long, would become the respected wife of the Privy Councillor and Baron. But just a few months after he married Christiane, Goethe fell in love with somebody else, Wilhelmine Herzlieb. She inspired Goethe to half a dozen sonnets, and is one source for the character of Ottilie in his novel Elective Affinities, which explores the complexities of the institution of marriage. Another young woman who idolized Goethe was Bettina Brentano. It was she who would give Goethe the idea of writing his autobiography, which he entitled Dichtung und Wahrheit, or Poetry and Truth. Christiane couldn't stand this insistent interloper. But about this time, Christiane's health began to fail, and after several years of suffering, she died on the 6th of June 1816 at the age of 51. On the day of her death, Goethe wrote in her memory,
"You attempt, O sun, in vain to shine through dark clouds. My life's entire profit is to lament her loss."
Goethe turned the living and sleeping quarters he had shared with Christiane into storerooms for his art collection. Returning to the front part of the house, we enter the Großes Sammlungszimmer, or large collection room. It's dominated by this portrait in oils by Heinrich Kolber of Duke Karl August, the man who had invited Goethe to Weimar and with whom Goethe would be bound in friendship for more than half a century. On the desk is St. Peter, a colored plaster cast of a figure by Peter Fischer and his sons from the tomb of St. Sebald in Nuremberg, which dates back to the early 16th century. Behind him is a small oil painting by Johann Peter Kaufmann, the Sibyl of Cumae offering her prophecies to Tarquin the Proud, King of Rome. This St. Jude, another of the 12 apostles, is also a cast of part of the tomb of St. Sebald. Behind him is an unusual love scene, Anacreon and Sappho by Johann Heinrich Tischbein, which had probably belonged to Goethe's parents. As did this painting. The Greek hero Hercules has been sold as a slave to Omphale, queen of Lydia, as punishment for having offended the gods. He so succumbed to her spell that he even did woman's work, spinning yarn for her at the distaff. Beside the door is Tischbein's portrait of Duchess Louise. Next to it, above the stove, is a copy of The Judgment of Paris by Peter Paul Rubens. Paris had the unenviable task of deciding who was most beautiful, Zeus's wife Hera, the virginal goddess of war Athene, or Aphrodite, the goddess of love. Goethe had such a large collection of art that only 2% of the works can be displayed here. This is a copy of an antique Venus with dolphin. Here a man is rising up out of a tiny sarcophagus, a resurrection scene in silver that dates back to the 12th century. Pomona, the goddess of fruit, is depicted with flowers and a cornucopia, and a Roman statue of the god Harpocrates. Here we see the goddess Diana, 2 warriors, and the gods Jupiter and Osiris. Just a small selection from Goethe's collection of small sculptures from the Greek, Roman, medieval and modern periods. Altogether, Goethe collected about 25,000 art objects. Ever since he was 20, he spent at least 100 gold ducats a year on art and antiquities. Here, 2 Roman bulls in bronze look out of the display cabinet. On the opposite wall, beside the window, an unknown beauty painted by an unknown artist. Goethe described her as a famous, beautiful woman of Frascati and said to stand before her was to enjoy beneficent sunshine. She might have felt at home in this ideal landscape by an unknown painter. We now go next door into the Majolica room. On top of the cabinet to the right of the doorway is a bust of the Russian Tsarina Alexandra Fyodorovna and of Queen Louise of Prussia. On the cabinet to the left is a bust by Johann Peter Kaufmann of Duke Karl August's daughter-in-law Maria Pavlovna, who was a daughter of the Tsar. This copper plate engraving by Karl Heinrich Rahl shows Hermann and Dorothea beside the well. It hangs on the left-hand wall of the alcove in the Majolica room, where Goethe and Christiane used to have their bed. On the cabinet, a marble bust of Duke Bernhard of Weimar by Friedrich Wilhelm Döhl. On the right-hand wall of the alcove hangs a watercolor of the Sibyl Persica by Goethe's friend Johann Heinrich Meyer. It's a copy of a work by the 17th century Italian painter Domenichino. The Majolica room derives its name from the collection of colorful enamel terracotta it houses. The pieces are Italian and date from the 16th century. Although Goethe became acquainted with Majolica while he was in Italy, he only started to collect it much later. The scenes depicted in rich Mediterranean colors are often from the New Testament, for example, the wedding of Joseph and Mary, or 3 women before the grave, or they're derived from classical mythology or Roman history. Goethe collected 100 pieces of Renaissance Majolica. Most was produced during that period in the workshops of Urbino, Faenza, Venice and Castel Durante. This plate tells the apocryphal story of the Jewess Judith, who penetrated the camp of the Assyrian general Holofernes, who was laying siege to her town, and cut off his head. Here we see, sitting under a tree and surrounded by his men, Octavian, the Roman general and adoptive son of Julius Caesar, who would later become the Emperor Augustus. With the destruction during the Second World War of the 1,000-piece faience collection at Berlin's Royal Palace, Goethe's Majolica collection became the second largest in Germany. But there isn't room here to display more than a few of the 100 pieces. Goethe wrote about the pleasure he derived from this collection.
The presence of these bowls, plates and vessels gives one the impression of competent and cheerful life.
Goethe's ideas about art were crucially influenced by the time he spent in Italy. It was now classical antiquity and the Renaissance that provided the models of excellence in landscape painting and in architecture. Someone who helped shape Goethe's developing taste was the Swiss painter Johann Heinrich Meyer, whom Goethe had met in Rome and brought to Weimar to advise him on matters of art. Meyer was a champion of classicism and won Goethe over to those ideals. Goethe only revised his views on art in 1814, when, on a trip along the Rhine, he visited the art collector Sulpitz Boisseret in Heidelberg and saw his collection of early German and Flemish art. Boisseret wrote to a friend about Goethe's visit.
In order to appreciate what a powerful impression our pictures made on Goethe, you must know that he'd never before seen a Jan van Eyck or any older German pictures apart from Cranach and Dürer. Every day he was in the gallery by 8 in the morning and would not come out again until midday. And we had to tell him all about their history and give him our opinions and comments. And he would tell us his.
On his way back to Weimar, he stopped off in Frankfurt, the town where he was born and grew up. He also visited his old friend, the banker Johann Jakob von Willemer, at his country house, the Gerbermühle. Earlier on that same trip, in Wiesbaden, Goethe had already met and fallen for Willemer's 30-year-old adoptive daughter, Marianne Jung. Goethe was then 65. He didn't conceal his affection for Marianne from Willemer, who was himself an elderly widower. So when on his return journey, Goethe arrived at the Gerbermühle in September 1814, he was surprised to find that Willemer and Marianne had just got married. That didn't stop Goethe from sending her poems.
In my garden's care and favour, from the east this tree's leaf shows secret scents for us to savour, and uplifts the one who knows. Is I but one being single, which as same itself divides? Are these two which choose to mingle, so that each as one now hides?
Goethe wrote these poems as if Hatem were addressing his beloved Zuleika. Marianne responded by sending Goethe poems of her own, which were just as good as his. They sometimes corresponded in code, just sending each other page and line numbers from a German translation of the Persian lyric poet Hafez. Discretion was called for in such a potentially difficult relationship. The next summer, Goethe visited the Gerbermühle again and spent several happy weeks there. Willemer didn't seem to object to Goethe courting Marianne. He may even have been somewhat proud that his wife was immortalized in the great man's latest poems. The songs to Zuleika are part of Goethe's Westöstlicher Divan, or West Eastern Divan, in which Goethe attempted to integrate Oriental poetic traditions. The songs represent a fiction, however. Goethe's love for Marianne remained unfulfilled, and after his second visit to the Gerbermühle, he would never see her again.
Das Deckenzimmer, or ceiling room, Goethe dedicated to art. Here he would peruse his etchings and drawings after dinner, often in the company of family and friends. On the wall, copies of works by Rubens, Raphael, Giulio Romano, and in the center, a large watercolor by Johann Heinrich Meyer. A copy of part of the fresco The Descent from the Cross by Daniele da Volterra in Rome. On the opposite wall, The Angel of the Annunciation, a pen and ink drawing based on a painting by Guido Reni. According to Goethe's theory, the color red in its light and thin state conveys the impression of grace and charm, of youthful kindness. To the left of the door is an allegorical representation of the Reformation by Peter Fischer, in ink and watercolor dating from the 16th century. Luther, as Hercules, ends the dominion of the Pope and destroys its vices. He frees the people and liberates the conscience and leads them towards Christ. A new era begins in which faith and justice once more come into their own. Goethe assiduously collected both original works and copies in order to acquaint himself with the history and the various schools of European art. He kept his 10,000 drawings, sketches and fine prints filed by their country of origin in large portfolios. He wrote about it in a novella about an art collector.
I read the history of art and must say, in praise of myself, that I did not learn the name of any master or learn about the life of any good man without seeking out some of his works in order not only to be able to recount his achievements in words, but to actually and visibly have them before me.
Goethe's collection includes works by famous artists such as Adam Elsheimer, as well as unusual works by the less well-known. Many of the prints we see in the reception rooms were given to Goethe by the artists themselves. Angelika Kaufmann presented him with these chalk drawings, the muses of drama praise Goethe, and a scene from Iphigenia. In his novella about an art collector, Goethe says what one should pay attention to when looking at a work of art.
In judging what the artist has achieved, apply the measure of greatness. Its units are the best we know. Assiduously seek what is most perfect. Always refer both the lover of art and the artist to the source. Always insist, as it were, upon the ultimate.
His most intimate friends would be asked to come into this room and discuss art with Goethe. That was considered a very special honor. Before we leave the room, let us take a look at the stove in the corner. The filigree ironwork was designed by Goethe himself, as was the stove in the large collection room. He didn't want to leave the architectural details of his house to chance.
Since Christiane's death in 1816, a lot had changed in the house on the Frauenplan. Goethe resumed work on Wilhelm Meister's Wanderjahre, Wilhelm Meister's Years of Travel, the great and complex novel of his old age, which he had begun and put aside some 2 decades earlier, and which was to be the sequel to Wilhelm Meister's apprenticeship. Goethe was now less concerned with the development of Wilhelm's character than with more general issues, the nature of society and political leadership, and the education of the young. In 1817, Goethe's son August married the capricious and strong-willed Ottilie von Pogwisch. She was full of life, but had little interest in running a household. Goethe's grandchildren Walter, born in 1818, Wolfgang, born 2 years later, and little Alma saw to it that his house was full of life and noise. But August and Ottilie were not happy in their marriage, and Goethe knew it. While his daughter-in-law flirted with young English gentlemen, August attended to the household. Goethe, known in the family simply as der Vater, the father, would not tolerate any fights in his presence. He loved his grandchildren dearly, and when playing with them, he had none of the aloof formality of the senior statesman. In the first third of the 19th century, Goethe's house in Weimar was a site of pilgrimage for all the leading intellectual and cultural figures of the time. Among the writers and philosophers who came to see Goethe were the brothers Alexander and Wilhelm von Humboldt, the brothers Friedrich and August Wilhelm von Schlegel, Schelling, Ludwig Tieck, Fichte, Jean-Paul, Hölderlin and Schopenhauer. Architects and artists also came, Schinkel, Friedrich Tieck, Rauch and Shadow to name but a few. Goethe usually received his guests here in the Yellow Salon.
Das kleine Esszimmer, or small dining room next door, was only used by the family and close friends. On display here now are gifts from artists who were friends of Goethe, watercolors, chalk and sepia drawings, and oil paintings. Goethe kept drawings of old masters in this large cabinet. He liked to show them to his visitors. On top, a copy of Minerva Velletri. Minerva, the goddess of peace and war, the arts and wisdom. Above the small table beside the wall on the left, The Bay of Palermo, a watercolor by Christoph Heinrich Kniep. Goethe met him in Naples, and as they traveled around Sicily together, Kniep taught Goethe how to paint in watercolor. In the far corner, a watercolor by Georg Melchior Kraus, the latest from Plunder's Weiland, based on a satirical text by Goethe about contemporary literary critics and magazines in the 1790s. To the left of the cabinet is a small drawing of Goethe's friend, the writer Christoph Martin Wieland, and to his right, a portrait in chalk of the philologist Friedrich August Wolff. The small oil painting below was a present from Goethe to his son August, Carl Gustav Carus's Das Brockenhaus, or the house on top of the Brocken Mountain. On top of the cabinet is a cast of a sculpture by Jakob Asmus Carstens of Atropos. Of the three fates of Greek mythology, she is the one who cuts the thread of human fate and thus determines the individual's moment of death. These porcelain cups were all gifts that Goethe received on his birthday or on jubilees, and they weren't meant to be used. They were specially made for him. As was this inkstand with the porcelain putto. And the glasses. They, however, were sometimes used on very special occasions. Goethe himself designed this biscuit porcelain Jubilee cup. Another cup was decorated with a portrait of Goethe by the porcelain painter Ludwig Sebers and dates from 1826. Goethe had been very reluctant to sit for him and commented ironically on such attention.
I should, in sibylline manner, in old age show off my face. The more it lacks in fullness, the more they want to paint it.
This Bohemian crystal glass was given to Goethe by the 20-year-old Ulrike von Levetzow, the object of his last unrequited love.
So, Paradise, as if you'd earned your standing and life forever beautiful you entered. No need to wish, to hope, no more demanding, the end on which your inward struggling centered. As you this signal beauty contemplated, the source of all your yearning tears abated. The kiss, the last one, sweet and anguished, sharing a weave of love so marvelously connected. Foot runs, holds back, never the threshold nearing, as though by cherubim in flames ejected. Eye stares on sombre path, as torments blind it. Looks back once more, the gate stays closed behind it. The world's all lost, myself as well I'm losing. I, once the favourite of gods on high, they tested me, for me Pandora choosing, so rich in gifts, in her more dangers lie. They urged me to that generous mouth, to fate me. They separate me and annihilate me.
A tearful Goethe read his Marienbad elegy to his best friend Carl Friedrich Zelter. A period of Goethe's life had come to an end. The most elegant room in the house is the Junozimmer, or Juno's Salon. This is where Goethe received the leading artists and scholars of the age. Music was an important part of life. Concerts were often held here. Many famous artists played this concert grand, the young Clara Wieck, Maria Szymanowska, and the 12-year-old Felix Mendelssohn. On the wall to the left hangs a watercolor by Johann Heinrich Meyer, a copy of the Aldobrandini Wedding, a 1st century Roman fresco, which realistically depicts wedding rites while also containing allegorical figures. The picture is rather faded. In fact, all the watercolors here, by now some 200 years old, are endangered by exposure to light. Friedrich Bury's Arion at Sea, for example. or Mayer's copy of a fresco at the Vatican by Raphael depicting Lot and his daughters fleeing Sodom. Looking to the left, we are face to face with an enormous bust of Juno. It's a cast of Juno Ludovisi. Goethe was almost ecstatic with delight when he first made her acquaintance in Rome, and wrote of the pleasure he felt in always having her colossal head before his eyes. Many decades after his time in Rome, he was reunited with her in 1823 when he received a new cast from Berlin. The panels above the two doors show satyrs being teased by amoretti, little winged gods of love. They too were painted by Mayer, Goethe's learned mentor in matters of art. The eagle on the stove is by Johann Peter Kaufmann. Zelter was one of Goethe's few truly close friends in his later years. And here, beneath Zelter's portrait, official guests would be seated. The furniture is Biedermeier in style, simple and elegant. On the table stands a plaster copy of a Roman bronze of the goddess Victoria. This is one of the few contemporary depictions of Goethe at home. Here he's seated with his friend Duke Karl August. This little messenger of the gods stood here at the very same spot almost 180 years ago. The last of the sequence of reception rooms at the front of the house is the Urbino-Saal or Urbino-Salon, so called because of the large portrait on the far wall of one of the Dukes of Urbino. But before we go any further, let us turn and bid farewell to Juno, knowing that she will remain there, unmoved and motionless. This room is also painted a cool blue, a color which, according to Goethe, has a strange and almost indescribable effect on the eye. The portrait of Francesco delle Rovere, Duke of Urbino, was painted around 1590 by Federico Barocci. Goethe bought it in 1790 while he was writing Torquato Tasso. In fact, the Duke and the poet Tasso were close friends as youngsters in Urbino. To the left, a portrait by Lucas Cranach the Younger of Johann Friedrich, Duke of Saxony, as a boy in around 1540. Below, portraits of Johann Georg, Duke of Saxony, and his wife. And a small portrait in oils from the school of Cranach, which may depict Katharina von Bora, the wife of Martin Luther. During the Second World War, the Urbino Salon was seriously damaged during a bombing raid in February 1945. All the artworks and furnishings had been removed from the Goethe House to a safer location, so when the salon was rebuilt after the war, it could be furnished and decorated as it had been in Goethe's time. These two cabinets, the one on top of the other, also survived the war. The bottom one is decorated with a paper cut by Adele Schopenhauer, the sister of the philosopher. The delicately carved cabinet on top dates from the 17th century. And on top of it, a miniature shrine with engravings based on an altar in Cologne Cathedral. And here, a landscape with white hind by Jean-Barthélemy Pascal, a gift from the painter to Goethe for his 79th birthday on August the 28th, 1828.
Goethe knew then that he did not have much time left for what he called his main business, the completion of Faust II. There were many distractions. He had to see to his correspondence and dictate to his scribe John as many as 12 letters a day. What took up the greatest part of his time, however, was the mammoth task to which he'd committed himself 2 years earlier in 1826. The preparation of a 40-volume authorized edition of his works for his publisher Johann Friedrich Cotter. He was helped in this enormous undertaking by a man who had already become his closest associate and confidant, who had wanted to become a writer and first came to Weimar to present the revered master with a copy of his first work. Johann Peter Eckermann, from the small town of Winsen near Hanover. Goethe was, however, less interested in Eckermann's literary talents than in his skill as an editor. Goethe didn't enjoy revising old manuscripts or published works. It was a time-consuming and exhausting activity. But Eckermann, he thought, was perfect for the job. Eckermann has often been described as Goethe's secretary, who merely noted down what the master had to say. But he was clearly more than that, an accomplished editor and author in his own right. It's nonetheless true to say that Eckermann did devote his life to Goethe, and at high personal cost. Goethe paid him so little that for many years he couldn't afford to marry and set up home with his betrothed. We can only speculate whether anyone would have heard of Eckermann if he'd only written down his own ideas instead of Goethe's. He published his Conversations with Goethe after the latter's death. Over the course of some 9 years, he had written down every evening, from memory, the substance of what they had talked about that day. The work is a very rich source of information on what Goethe thought about his time, the world, and its creator.
It's natural to man, said Goethe, to regard himself as the final cause of creation, and to consider all other things merely in relation to himself, so far as they are of use to him. He makes himself master of the vegetable and animal world, and while he claims other creatures as fitting diet, he acknowledges his God and praises his goodness in this paternal care. He takes milk from the cow, honey from the bee, wool from the sheep, and while he gives things a purpose which is useful to himself, he believes that they were made on that account. Nay, he cannot conceive that even the smallest herb was not made for him. As if he has not yet ascertained its utility, he believes he may discover it in future. Then too, as man thinks in general, so does he always think in particular, and he does not fail to transfer his ordinary views from life into science, and to ask the use and purpose of every single part of our organic being. This may do for a time, and he may get on so for a time in science, but he will soon come to phenomena where his small view will not be sufficient, and where, if he does not take a higher stand, he will soon be involved in mere contradictions. The utility teachers say that oxen have horns to defend themselves. But I ask, why is the sheep without any? And when it has them, why are they twisted about the ears so as to answer no purpose at all? If, on the other hand, I say the ox defends himself with his horns because he has them, it's quite a different matter. The question as to the purpose, the question wherefore, is completely unscientific. But we get on farther with the question how. For if I ask, how has the ox horns, I am led to study his organization and learn at the same time why the lion has no horns and cannot have any. The teachers of utility would think that they lost their God if they did not worship him who gave the ox horns to defend himself. But I hope I may be allowed to worship him who, in the abundance of his creation, was great enough, after making 1,000 kinds of plants, to make one more, in which all the rest should be comprised, and after 1,000 kinds of animals, a being comprising them all, man. I worship him who has infused into the world such a power of production that when only the millionth part of it comes out into life, the world swarms with creatures to such a degree that war, pestilence, fire and water cannot prevail against them. That is my God.
In the 1820s, Goethe's house in Weimar was a unique centre of cultural life. Not only artists and thinkers, but also crowned heads of state from all over Europe would come to pay their respects. But most only got to see the public face of Goethe, the statesman, formal and somewhat stiff, even on such festive occasions as the ceremony to mark the 50th anniversary of his arrival in Weimar.
Few visitors had the honor of accompanying Goethe through the Urbino room and down a short flight of stairs into his private quarters. Then, as now, the small dark vestibule contains two unadorned grey cabinets in which the most beautiful and rarest rocks in his collection were displayed. Between the windows, the old grandfather clock which had stood in Goethe's parents' house in Frankfurt. The library is out of bounds to visiting tourists. It contains 5,500 books published over 3 centuries. Books about mythology, the arts, theatre and theology. Treatises on law and economics. Essays on aesthetics, pedagogy, Freemasonry, history and geography, mathematics, engineering and medicine. There were few areas of human knowledge in which the owner of this library showed no interest. Goethe did not seek to collect rare or particularly exquisite books. Although as a privy councillor and minister of state he was far from poor, he simply wasn't interested in pursuing such an expensive hobby. For Goethe, his library was a place to work. He wrote, as you may recall,
I did not collect arbitrarily or on a whim, but methodically and purposefully. I've learned something from every object in my possession.
Here are first editions of Goethe's own works, some with handwritten corrections he made for the 40-volume authorized edition. Here, the sorrows of young Werther, Clavigo, Torquato Tasso, Wilhelmine and Faust, in English and French translation. The collection also includes French, Italian, Latin and English literature, for the most part in the original language. Rousseau, Voltaire, Dante, Ariosto, Petrarch and Tasso. Cervantes, Shakespeare, Byron and Carlyle. Oriental writers such as the Persian poet Hafez. And also contemporary authors, Victor Hugo, Alexander Pushkin and countless others. The catalogue of this unique private library runs to almost 800 pages. From the library, we enter Goethe's study. It's an austere room. There are no pictures on the walls and no curtains at the windows. Dark green linen blinds keep out the sunlight. After his return from Italy, this is where Goethe wrote almost all his works. He dictated thousands of letters here, drafts and notes for his literary and scientific works, his theory of color. It's also where he would come to be alone and think. Over the past century, millions of people from around the world have stood on the threshold and peered reverentially into the study of the great man. And yet, it's as if time has stood still here. Goethe's study is almost exactly the way it was then. It survived the subsequent 170 years of German history, the founding of the German Empire, the Nazis, and East Germany. The spotlights, the camera teams, and the tourists with all their eager questions. Goethe once said,
If you demand a wise answer, you must ask a sensible question.
Goethe, who had discovered so many answers, yet never ceased to ask. He lived to see the first published volumes of the last authorized edition. He'd started work on it in 1822, and it took up much of his time in his final years. His own writings on art and antiquity and on the natural sciences are ready to hand, and a collection of reference works, including dictionaries of German, English, French, and Italian. Goethe devoted his final years above all to the completion of Faust II, a gigantic work he'd begun 3 decades earlier.
And this as wisdom's final word I teach, only that man earns freedom, merits life, who must reconquer both in constant daily strife, in such a place, by danger still surrounded, youth, manhood, age, their brave new world have founded. I long to see that multitude and stand with a free people on free land. Then to the moment I might say, beautiful moment, do not pass away. Till many ages shall have passed, this record of my earthly life shall last.
In 1825, Goethe finally resolved to devote himself to finishing what he called his strange work of sorcery. When it was finished, he sealed the manuscript and locked it away in this cabinet, just a few months before his death. He didn't want to know what the critics would make of Faust II, his very serious joke, full of wordplay, allusions, symbols, and allegories. Faust, Goethe's alter ego, searches for knowledge and the meaning of the universe, and ultimately finds redemption through self-denial. Faust II was Goethe's final gift to posterity, the culmination of his life's work. Its complexity and elusiveness have kept literary scholars busy to this day. In his last years, Goethe also continued to pursue his research in the natural sciences. Everything here is exactly as he left it. This bottle of opaline glass, its stopper a bust of Napoleon, was a present from Eckermann.
In 1830, Goethe's son August died in Rome and was buried at the foot of the pyramid of Cestius. It was a deep blow to Goethe and cast a dark shadow over his final years. In the summer of 1831, Goethe often withdrew to the seclusion of his cottage by the river Ilm. He laid out in front of the garden gate a pentagram of white pebbles as a charm to guard against evil, just like Faust, who'd inscribed a pentagram on the threshold of his study. Goethe wrote in his poem Vermächtnis, or Testament,
No thing on earth to naught can fall. The eternal onward moves in all. Rejoice by being, be sustained. Being is deathless, living wealth, with which the all adorns itself, by laws abides and is maintained. Long since the true was found, and could spirits join in brotherhood. The ancient truth set hand upon, thank now the sage. O child of earth, who showed her and her kin the path, for circuiting about the sun.
Goethe spent the day before his 82nd birthday on the Kickelhahn, a hill above the town of Ilmenau. He found there, in the wall of a hunting lodge, verses he'd carved into the wood 50 years earlier.
Over all the hilltops is quiet now. In all the treetops hearest thou hardly a breath. The birds are asleep in the trees. Wait, soon like these, thou too shall rest.
In March 1832, at the first sign of spring, Goethe went on an outing to the country. He caught a cold and took to his bed. He would not leave his bedroom alive. It too is an austere room like a monk's cell. An eye shade to keep out the flickering light of a candle. A narrow pine bed. The walls lined in fabric to keep out the cold. And a bell pull to summon the servant. This armchair Goethe bought at an auction a year before his death. There are no mementos or other personal objects in the room, and no pictures on the pale green walls, but 2 tables, the one about music, the other about geology. The stool in front of the armchair is embroidered with the face of a woman surrounded by flowers. On March the 22nd, Goethe's condition deteriorated. Sitting upright in his chair, his mind clear, he issued some instructions. Then his speech began to slur. He mumbled. His voice became quieter and quieter until no one could understand what he was trying to say. Goethe died at 12:30. The hands of the clock were set to that moment. It said the last words he uttered were, "More light." All his life he had indeed detested darkness in all its manifestations. Goethe's house on the Frauenplan has come to stand for an era in which Weimar was the site of an exquisite flowering of the mind that has influenced the entire civilized world and left a legacy for us to cherish and preserve.